Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us, and then you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
This comes from the second chapter of John's Gospel. He writes, "On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, 'They have no more wine.' 'Dear woman, why do you involve me?' Jesus replied. 'My time has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.' Now nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' And so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet.' They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So he called the bridegroom aside and said, 'Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now.' This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. One of my favorite comedians is a guy named Jim Gaffigan, and he remarks that holidays on the whole are really just excuses in America for us to overeat. He says, I wouldn't normally have a brat, a burger, and a steak, but it's 4th of July. It's what the founding fathers would have wanted, and I need all this energy because I have to go blow some stuff up later on, right? And when you think about it, there's some truth to it. That the center of all of our holiday celebrations, there is a special food that we think of. For 4th of July, we think about grilling out. For Easter, we think about Eggs. You can say it with me, eggs. I did this the previous service, and they didn't lead with the slide. So I said, Easter, what do you think? Everyone said ham. And I thought, ham. But eggs, too. For Valentine's Day, we think of chocolate, not those little, like chalk things that have be mine written on. Chocolate. For Halloween, we got candy. And for Christmas, maybe it's not just one food, it's a whole feast that we enjoy after the presents are opened. The Christmas feast, though, is just, it's like a baby compared to the grand feast of Thanksgiving that we're about to celebrate. I mean, when you think about the food we're going to have just a few days from now, it's turkey, dressing, noodles, mounds of mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potato casserole, green bean casserole, corn casserole, casseroles you don't even know what's in them, but they taste so good. And then there's that canned stuff, the cranberry jelly that no one eats, but it's all part of this feast. Pumpkin pie, yes. I didn't even get to the desserts. That's how good Thanksgiving is, right? I was full. We hadn't even talked about the desserts. But that's the thing. Feasting is at the center of all of our celebrations. Why is that? Because feasting is a sign of abundance. It reminds us that our lives are rich and full, that we have so much stuff we can't even hold it all in. Feasting is how we celebrate. And not just at holidays, but anytime we have major life transitions. Think about birthdays. What do we do every birthday? We have a big old cake. Funerals, maybe not a cause for celebration, but it's an important life transition. And you better believe, for weeks, neighbors just keep bringing in the pans of food, more than a family could possibly hold. But there is no life transition, no celebration, no feast that is more meticulously planned and ruinously expensive than the wedding feast, right? Like months and months and months go into planning this one feast because it's the biggest celebration of them all. And that's not just true in our day. It was true in Jesus' day as well. It was the biggest feast of them all. Take a look at today's story, and if you pay attention, you get a clue to how the invitations worked. You see, it says Jesus' mother, Mary, was at the feast, and also Jesus, and also his disciples. You see, Mary is the friend of the family. She's the one that got the invitation. But you can't invite Mary and not invite her oldest son, Jesus, who was probably the breadwinner for the family at this point. And you can't invite Jesus without also extending an invitation to his entourage. I mean, it's kind of the way weddings work today, right? Like, you're going down the wedding list and you think, well, if we include so-and-so, then we got to include their children too. And if we invite Bill, then, well, his brother or his neighbors, like the circle kind of gets exponentially bigger, and it's tough to know where to close it off. So before you know it, the whole village is coming to the party. That would have been true in Jesus' day. And the host of the party, They thought they had planned for this occasion. They sent out the invitations. They welcomed everyone, but when everyone arrived, they quickly realized that they didn't have enough to keep the feast going. Before long, glasses that were once readily filled every time they were raised, the servants would come around and fill them. Now they're staying empty just a little bit longer. People are beginning to whisper, what's going on here? Why isn't anyone refilling all this wine? See, that balloon of abundance is about to be popped. And it's going to result in shame and embarrassment for the host. It's already causing a great deal of anxiety and fear. And Mary sees what's going on. She's a friend of the family, and she doesn't want to see them embarrassed, so she goes to her son Jesus, and she says, she doesn't even ask him to do anything per se. She just states the facts. They're running out of wine. And Jesus says, woman, what does that have to do with me? You get like this little glimpse into their relationship, right? He says, woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour's not yet come. But it's not really so disrespectful because Mary doesn't even really, listen to his objections. She's like, duly noted, and then she turns to the servants and says, do whatever he says. And Jesus is obedient and honoring enough that he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. And he tells the servants to fill the ceremonial wine jugs with water, or water jugs, ceremony washing, all the way to the brim. And he says, now take some of that water and take it to the chief of the party, the chief steward. And of course, from the time it goes from the jug to the time it reaches the steward's lips, it's been miraculously transformed into wine. And John summarizes, he says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of his signs. The first. Really? The first? Do you ever have that question? Why does Jesus choose this as the first of his signs? Because the first is kind of important. I mean, why didn't Jesus raise someone from the dead or heal someone who was sick or feed 5,000? Do anything other than just make alcohol for a party to continue? Why is this the first of his signs, the first of his miracles? I grew up in a dry county. I grew up in a very dry home. I didn't have my first taste of alcohol until I was in seminary, which is ironic when you think about it, right? And so for me growing up, I couldn't understand, why is Jesus making wine? I mean, we know that wine and alcohol can be destructive in people's lives. So why is his miracle to make more of it? And you may be wondering, why is Pastor Dave talking about wine before Thanksgiving? And it's not because some of us need wine to get through the holidays, It's because I think the answer of why Jesus chooses this as the first of his signs, it gets to the heart of what we celebrate at Thanksgiving. So let me suggest for you 3 significances of this miracle, what it represents. The first is the turning of water into wine. It represents an affirmation of human connections. You see, most of those miracles that I talked about earlier, the feeding of the 5,000, the making the lame walk, helping the blind to see, cleansing of the lepers, all those are Jesus fixing something that is broken in the world. But this is not Jesus fixing something that is broken. It's Jesus affirming something that is right with the world. That it's right, it's good for 2 people to come together and pledge their love and covenant with each other. It's right and it's good that their families should surround them in celebration. It's right and good that friends and neighbors should be invited to the feast and that we should share our abundance with each other. This is right and good, and Jesus' miracle enables good to keep on going. If there's anything Jesus is fixing, he's fixing scarcity. He's fixing shame and embarrassment. He doesn't want anything to interrupt this feast that is going on right now. You see, the feast is a central metaphor in Scripture for what heaven is going to be like someday. It's true in both the Old Testament and the New. In the Old Testament, you have prophets like Joel and Amos who say things like this. Joel says, in that day, speaking of when God comes in final glory, in that day, the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of Acacias. Amos says something very similar. The words are almost exactly like, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when new wine will drip from the mountains and flow from the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They rebuild ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. It's a sign of prosperity, this feast. And even Jesus picks up on it. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a feast that a king threw for his son. The feast, that celebration, is at the center of what heaven will be like. Author Max Lucado, he says, the feasts that we enjoy are just a foretaste of the glory that awaits us in heaven. You know what a foretaste is, right? You're going to experience one this week, no doubt. You're going to take that turkey out of the oven, and it looks so good, all glistening brown, and you're going to think, I just want to snag a little piece and make sure it tastes as juicy and good as it looks. And so you just strip off a little bit and pop it in your mouth. Or you see a casserole that looks so tasty and the smells just fill your nostrils. And you think, I just want to make sure it's warm enough. And so you stick your fork in the corner and you dig out and then you smooth it over so no one can see what you took. And then you taste. Or the pie, the pumpkin pie is going, well, let's just make sure this batter is right. I dip my finger in and I pop it in my mouth. These are just foretastes. They're not the feast. But what these foretastes do is they build in us an anticipation of how great the feast is going to be. In the same way, when we experience our feast here in heaven, that's not even the true abundance. They're just foretastes, building in us anticipation and excitement for how good the great banquet of heaven is going to be. Because in that place, all human connections will be restored and renewed. We'll be reunited with all those with whom we've been separated by distance, by sin, by death. We'll be reunited with our parents and our grandparents and their parents before them. We'll be reunited with our brothers and our sisters. We'll be reunited with neighbors and friends. And even with our enemies, we'll be reconciled. And we'll sit down at the table together and enjoy a feast like none other. So this miracle is just a foretaste of how good that human connection will be. Not only that, it's a celebration of abundance. Because Jesus produces a lot of wine. I don't know what you picture when you think of those jars. I used to always picture like milk jug type things, but no, these are huge stone water jugs that were used for ceremonial cleansing and washing by the Jews. They would have been as tall and as big as this baptismal font, you know? Each one holding 20 to 30 gallons of water. You do the math, you just take the average 25 gallons and you get to 150 gallons of water, which is 750 bottles of wine. Jesus produces more wine than could possibly be consumed. You see, Jesus produces more than enough. You go forward just a few chapters in John, you get to the feeding of the 5,000. Again, Jesus doesn't produce just enough to feed everyone. He produces more than enough. When the miracle is all over, they gather up 12 baskets of food. Because when we follow Jesus and trust in his grace, we end up with more than we started in the beginning. I mean, Jesus' abundance is so great that it blesses those who have no idea who he is. You see, that's kind of the funny part about this story. The stewards, the servants take the wine to the steward. And when the steward tastes, he doesn't ask the servants, where did this wine come from? Who gave it to you? Instead, he calls the bridegroom over and says, wow, thanks for this amazing wine. And the bridegroom doesn't know what he's talking about. He's like, okay, thanks, And then all the guests, none of them know where the wine is. The only people who know where the wine is coming from are the servants and the disciples and Mary. Everyone else is completely oblivious. But that's how great Jesus' abundance is. It blesses those who don't even know where it's coming from. And I think about in my own life, how often I am unaware of where the abundance is coming from. I mean, how often do I think that I created it, that I worked hard to make all this abundance appear, when really it was Jesus who was behind it all, right? And that's not to say that we can't enjoy the abundance, even if we don't recognize where it comes from. Sure, the people at the party, they enjoyed the wine, even without knowing it comes from Jesus. But here's where I think it comes in. When we fail to recognize the source of the abundance, what does it do to our hearts? We get consumed with anxiety. We get consumed with scarcity. We are so afraid that the blessing is going to run out that we hold on to it as hard as we can, or we think that we're the ones producing the blessing, so we have to kill ourselves to keep it going and keep on producing. I know some of you will work in the kitchen this Thanksgiving and you will knock yourself out, and in the process you will miss the abundance. you won't slow down to enjoy it and taste it and savor it and see that it's good. When we recognize that the abundance comes from Jesus and that Jesus is always, always in our midst, it sets us free to take a deep breath and realize it's not coming from me. It's just for me to enjoy and appreciate. We can taste and see that the Lord is good. So it is an affirmation of human connection. It's a celebration of God's abundance. And lastly, I think this miracle is a sign of Jesus' glory. That's what John says. When the miracle is all over, he says, this is the first of Jesus' signs that he performed. It's interesting he calls them signs and not miracles. Signs, because a sign is something that points to something other than itself. When you see a sign, it's not really supposed to call attention to itself unless it's like those billboards along the highway that say, advertise here. No, signs are meant to point to what's coming up, what's in your future. And in the same way, this sign, John says, points to something else. What does it point to? Well, there's some clues. If you kind of put on your Sherlock Holmes hat and do some biblical detective work with me, there's signs, little clues in this story. The first is how he begins the story. The first 4 words, he says, on the 3rd day. Well, we know as Christians, on the 3rd day, that's like a significant way to begin the story. John's, of course, he's building a timeline. In the first chapter of John, Jesus is baptized. And then the next chapter, or the next day, he calls his disciples. And on the 3rd day, he goes to the wedding. But when he begins the story this way, John knows that all of his Christian readers, that they can fill in the rest of the sentence, right? It's like if I were to go down to Texas and I were to stand somewhere and sing, the stars at night are big and bright. Come on, sing it with me. Deep in the heart of Texas. I've seen Pee Wee Herman. That's how it works, right? But they know the rest of the song. And so we know the rest of the song. We know what follows when we say, on the 3rd day, Jesus rose from the dead. He ascended into heaven and sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From thence he shall come to judge and to cook the dead. We know what the rest of that story is. So that's our first clue. Our next clue is when Jesus says to his mother, my hour has not yet come. Now, Jesus isn't just saying, I'm not ready to perform a miracle yet. I'm not ready for people to know who I am. I'm not ready to start my ministry. No, when Jesus says hour, in John's gospel, he's always talking about his death, his arrest and his crucifixion. You see it. There's like 7 verses I could have chosen. I just put 2 up just so you get the flavor of it. But, John 7. At this, they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. And then when his hour does come, Jesus gathers his disciples for a closing feast. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. So whenever we hear that, the hour, we know it's pointing to Jesus' death. Then we have another clue, which is just the symbolism of wine itself. Now, I've already told you how in the Old Testament, the wine was a symbol of abundance and celebration and feasting, but in Christian practice, in our memory, wine always points to sacrifice. Because we remember how in the last Passover, Jesus took a cup of wine and said, take and drink each of you, for this is my blood, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me. And just in case you miss that, 4 chapters later, Jesus feeds 5,000. And what does he say at the end of the feeding of the 5,000? He says, I am the bread of life. All who believe in me and follow me will never hunger and never thirst. So in the first couple chapters of John, you have wine and bread, Jesus offering his body and his blood. And then you get the symbolism of the wedding itself. You see, in the Old Testament, That was the way the prophets understood the relationship between God and Israel, that they were married to one another, that they were bound in a covenant with one another, a covenant so strong that even when Israel was unfaithful and went after other gods, Yahweh could not give them up. And the prophets pointed to the day when they would be bound back together, when their wedding vows would be renewed. And so in Hosea, we see a passage like this. In that day, Hosea declares, "You will call me my husband. You'll no longer call me my master. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. I will show my love to the one called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will respond and say, you are my God." You see, that was the picture, that God was going to bring Israel back unto himself. And Paul picks up on this metaphor, but he says that's not just it. It wasn't just about Israel being reunited with God, and it's that God was extending the covenant to all the world, to the church, through his son, Christ Jesus. And so Paul, this is Ephesians 5 from the Message translation, but he says this is a mystery. He says, "Husbands, go all out in your love for your wives, exactly as Christ did for the church. A love marked by giving, not getting. Christ's love makes the church whole. His words evoke her beauty. Everything he does and says is designed to bring out the best of her, dressing her in dazzling white silk, radiant with holiness." So let's put this together. This is like the Sherlock Holmes moment where he pulls all the clues together. You got Jesus at a party, and he provides wine. And the steward calls the bridegroom over and says, "Thank you for this great wine that you provided." And the bridegroom says, "Thanks," but he doesn't know where it comes from. What he doesn't know is that the true bridegroom is there at the party. The one who would lay down his life in love for the world. And this miracle of providing wine, it points to that moment when Jesus would lay down his life in order to rescue and redeem our hearts and to bind us forever in covenant with God. That's what this story is pointing to. Jesus begins his ministry, as one commentator says, with a vivid picture of what he has to offer, which is himself. His life, that's what Jesus has to give us. And that is his glory. That's what John says, his glory is revealed. And it's not like it's revealed like he gets credit. Remember, the bridegroom gets all the credit. The guests are oblivious. And it's different because in the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the moment where Jesus' glory is revealed is he goes up on a mountain. We call it the Transfiguration. You may know the story. He goes up on the mountain, and then when he goes up on this mountain to pray with his disciples, his robes are changed into like this dazzling white, and his face radiates like the sun, and they bow down and realize who he is. In John's Gospel, there's no transfiguration. This is the moment when his glory is revealed. There's no spotlight on Jesus. Instead, Jesus stands at the edge of the spotlight. And his glory is to let it all happen, to make it possible for two people wed in love to celebrate, to make it possible for their families to feast for them, to make it possible for friends to gather. And he just keeps the good on going. That's Jesus' glory, is to restore the goodness of creation. Wendell Berry says, he's talking about moonshine coming out of a jug, but I think it also works with wine coming out of a bottle. It makes a sound. It goes like this. Good, 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 good. And I think what Jesus is doing at this party is saying, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. And I'm willing to give my life to reclaim this goodness and to make it last forever. So what does this mean for us? Don't miss it. When you gather with your loved ones this Thanksgiving season, amidst all the craziness and the chaos, don't miss it. Don't miss the goodness of the laughter. Don't miss the goodness of the love. Don't miss the goodness of just being together and the taste of the food, and savor it because it is all good and blessed. Don't miss it. And don't miss the unseen guest. Don't miss the one who stands on the fringe. The one whose goodness and mercy and abundance has provided it all. You may not see him, but he's there. And he's smiling, and he's blessing you. Don't miss his presence, because it's his love, it's Jesus' abundance that makes our hearts whole and able to enjoy it. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. So this Thanksgiving, don't miss the abundant life that Jesus has to offer you. Amen. Amen.